Welcome back. After a short break, I hope you had a great time. Now, please join us for the opening of the plenary session on housing solutions for refugees and migrants in changing world. A chance for a dialogue on collaborative, innovative approaches to housing that not only addresses immediate needs, but also foster long-term stability and integration for refugees and migrants. The session will be led by Mounia Tagma, international housing policy expert. Mounia's work focuses on affordable housing issues in MENA and African countries. She currently works on housing projects for the World Bank and International Finance Corporation in MENA and Africa. Mounia, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Very nice to be with you today for an enriching discussion, I am sure, about housing solutions for refugees and migrants in a changing world. Some of our speakers today do work that is more focused on refugees. Others do work that is more focused on migrants. Some of them have been working with both refugees and migrants, but I'm sure we will hear very interesting perspectives from them on both topics. Over 114 million people have been displaced worldwide, forcibly displaced. That includes internally displaced people, and 36% of the world refugees are in Europe. This is according to the UNHCR at the end of 2022. We are at an unprecedented level of waves of displacement. This is a record high, and unfortunately, the news are very worrying, and we might anticipate more waves of refugees and migrants in the upcoming years. For this panel, I would like to start on my left with introducing Patrick Canagasingham, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Habitat of Humanity International. Welcome, Patrick, and thank you for hosting us today. Patrick has over 25 years of experience in the NGO and private sector. He joined Habitat in 2020, and before joining Habitat, he had experience being the CEO of Children Believe. He also was the Chief Operating Officer of Oxfam International and worked with a number of other organizations. Next to Patrick, we have Livia Styp-Rekowska. Good morning, Livia. Livia is the Chief of Mission at IOM, the International Organization for Migration in Poland. She has been in that position since 2021. She's responsible as the Chief of Mission of IOM in Poland for leading the Poland's Ukraine refugee response. In 2022, IOM Poland provided support to 80,000 refugees, migrants, and including the Polish community as well in that context. Thank you for being with us today, Livia. Next to Livia, we have Kevin. Kevin is the representative of the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Over the past 10 years with the UNHCR, Kevin has worked in a variety of geographies and in different capacities. He has worked in Bangladesh, Nepal, Tajikistan, on the Kenya-Somalia border, in Mexico, and the list goes on and on. Kevin also has worked for the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations in Kosovo. So Kevin has a very long experience and expertise to share with us today. Last but not least, we have the pleasure of having with us Miroslava Keryk. Miroslava is the chairperson of the Ukrainian House Board Foundation. She is a historian, sociologist, and specialist in the migration of Ukrainians to Poland. Miroslava wears many hats, but I would say in her work, if you correct me if I'm wrong, I think you try to combine your research on the topic of migration with hands-on work with communities and try to make the society here in Poland more acceptant of diversity. Thank you all for being with us today. My first question would be to all of you in your different capacities. How does the refugee crisis in Europe and the one we see here in Poland, in particular with Ukraine, impact housing challenges in the host countries and impact housing challenges in Poland, but in all the host countries that you have experience with? What are the most pressing challenges that result to this from this crisis, especially in terms of housing when it comes to vulnerable communities? And how have your organizations responded to this challenge? If I may start with you, Patrick, and if you could speak from the standpoint of Habitat. I will, unless I get another one.
I think for me, let me begin by stating the obvious. So here in Europe, there has generally been a trend towards, a scarcity of housing, and that includes rentals as well. Just go back 2 years, the war breaks out, and I was here in Poland just after the war broke out. And one of the things, a sentiment that I repeatedly heard, including talking to both UNHCR and IOM at that point, but also the city of Warsaw, is what was seen as a problem was further amplified, meaning the demand for housing. And that also resulted in an increase in looking at rentals, for example. So think of an existing problem that was already there, further amplified by the influx of refugees coming into the country. And for Habitat, we had a couple of choices. We are a long-term, what we call a housing organization. We are not an emergency response organization. And yet, we could not have ignored the reality that shelter had to be at the core of our interventions. So just not in Poland, but in our neighboring countries, including Hungary, Poland, etc., what our officers and our colleagues did at that point was to look for viable short-term solutions to ensure that our relevance was understood. So then we could start thinking about long-term solutions. Why was it important for us? Like someone once said, if you're not at the table having these critical conversations, you'll be on the menu. And we didn't want to be on the menu. We wanted to be at the table to ensure that Habitat's role, even as far as our long-term support was concerned, was understood. A related piece, coming back to some of the weaknesses that we felt and experienced during this period, and we continue to experience, is look at the social infrastructure that's relatively fragile at this point, taking care of domestic needs. And what Habitat discovered, because we penetrated quite a bit at a community level in the countries where we are present in this region, is with the influx of refugees and migrants, is the fragility, again, is beginning to show big time. So when we look at our interventions as Habitat for Humanity, we are so thankful that we work with partners like UNHCR, IOM, and a lot of actually domestic organizations, including local government, etc. We are thankful that we can collectively come together, put our heads together, and look at viable solutions.
Patrick. Livia, could you speak from the standpoint of IOM?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you so much for inviting us. I have very nice memories of the Housing Forum from last year. So it's really great to be in this company again. And thank you as well for this question. It's very interesting because just yesterday I was looking at the Eurostat statistics for Poland in terms of housing, and I was double-checking the statistics because I couldn't believe it. But Poland is indeed, and actually all the neighboring countries as well, Slovakia, Romania, countries of very high ownership. In Poland specifically, 85% of the population lives in households or households live in places that own their own home. But there are some very worrying trends, which again, as you mentioned, when there is an influx of migrants or refugees, of course, it does have a very direct and immediate impact on the residential situation and housing situation in the country. So what we have seen in terms of the housing market trends is that there has been a decrease from 2023 compared to 2022, a 19% decrease in the number of residential units that have been licensed for construction. And there had also been an 8% decrease in the residential units completed. So in a situation where you have a huge influx of additional refugees, migrants into the country, we're actually seeing a decrease in the units that are being constructed and being made available for this additional population. This is hugely exacerbated in cities because obviously when we look at the statistics in terms of population, the big cities in Poland, Warsaw for sure, but others as well, have by far bore the brunt of the population increase following the crisis in Ukraine. That said, and I'm quoting here a Habitat report, we do have quite a lot of the housing stock, 11% that is left unoccupied or empty. And this is due to the fact that either there is ownership issues that are unresolved or there is uncertain legal status, lack of funds for renovations. So part of the housing response in the early days of and early months of the crisis, and in fact it continues today, is identifying these unused buildings to convert them, as has been done in the past, and as I said, continues to this day, to convert them to collective shelters or other places of residence for refugees who have found a refuge here in Poland. That said, I do want to shed light a bit on data, because collective shelters, while they have filled a very, very important role and continue to fill a very important role in terms of being a place of temporary residence for many of the refugees who have come, we have faced challenges in having a complete overview in terms of data, where these collective shelters are, how many people reside there, and this is due to the fact that these are run by many different entities, ranging from local authorities to NGOs to private entities. So it has been quite a challenge to put it all together in a comprehensive way. And the other thing I would like to emphasize that it has been a bit challenging to ensure uniform standards, which is something that IOM and UNHCR work on very closely in terms of capacity building of those who manage and run these shelters, to make sure that they comply with national and European standards. Of course, a particular challenge in terms of collective shelters and housing in general are the minorities, specifically the Roma minority, who have been part of the refugee flows into Poland and who have faced consistent challenges in accessing private housing or, in fact, even the collective shelters as well. Now, as a leader, together with Habitat, of the shelter, housing and accommodation sector under the Refugee Response Plan here in Poland, we have assisted since February 2022 over 250,000 of refugees and who have arrived in Poland, and reached over hundreds of these, 117 to be precise, these collective shelters around the Poland. But we know that this is a portion of all the collective shelters that there are in Poland. So I would say that the challenge has been, as I said, trying to work with the housing market, which was challenging already before the crisis, let alone now, but also to look at housing more broadly, specifically now housing including collective shelters, and make sure that rather than being temporary solutions, some families have been there from day one and continue to live there 2 years later, making sure that even this temporary housing meets certain standards and is part of a wider policy solution. Thank you.
Yeah, you're mentioning here a solution when faced with the constraints of a market that's not providing enough supply, of using the existing vacant stock. And I think that's what we try to do in our daily work, come up with solutions, especially ones that do not require too much time in an emergency situation. Kevin, can you tell us from the standpoint of UNHCR?
Well, first, I'm very happy to be here with Habitat, with the IOM, with Ukrainian House. And I'm very happy to see that there's a number of participants here from the full range of society, from the private sector, from the government, from civil society, and I think even from the refugee and migrant community itself. One thing is very clear to me from my vantage point, and that is to tackle this problem, which is not just a problem for migrants or refugees, but for Poles. We really have to have a comprehensive approach. And part of that will likely include social housing, and that implicates budget, state budget, because there are going to be some people who are so on the margins that they simply don't have access to other options. But what I'm particularly excited about, and what I hope this forum will generate and build upon last year's forum, is some of the innovations that Habitat has pioneered in the context of social rental agency schemes. At the same time, refurbishment of vacant buildings. There's an awful lot of them in Poland. But maybe even more than that, just from my personal vantage point, I'm particularly keen to hear what this group and experts in the room have to say about public-private partnership. And this is something that we are exploring in liaison with the International Finance Corporation in Poland, and how to potentially catalyze initiatives to increase the supply on the supply and demand equation at the municipal level. And there's 3 different cities, I won't name them here in this forum, potentially 4, who are going to be part of a pilot project where we're going to do modeling to try to assess how do you bring in different types of capital from private banks, but also potentially offset by international financial institutions to reduce the interest rates or the risk, to make it a more interesting package. But that also needs to include cities, municipalities. And I just briefly met, I think, the deputy mayor of Sofia from Bulgaria, and I'm quite interested to hear, for example, some of the insights they have from their perspective in Sofia. So I think these are some of the policy options that we can look at together, and that I'm interested to hear more about. But as Livia very rightly mentioned, and Patrick as well, at the outset of this situation, we were talking in the initial instance about emergency response. Now, when I have participated in emergency responses in the past, it's involved bamboo and plastic sheeting and wire, and that was what we called a shelter, until we could upscale it to a medium, term shelter, which sometimes in some places I worked, the government wouldn't even allow us to do because they didn't want refugees to stay. But in this case, in the case of Poland and the European response to the Ukraine situation specifically, we've seen exemplary solidarity across the board, starting with the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, people getting access to education, to healthcare, the ability to work, but also, if you read the Temporary Protection Directive, the right to housing. Now, it's one thing to talk about rights in international law or in international instruments. It exists, it's there, we certainly support that. But practically, how do you make that a reality is the more difficult question. And that's where I think we have to have a very rich and comprehensive discussion. And frankly, it exceeds my expertise as an official of the UN Refugee Agency, that involves public policy, that involves the private sector, and that involves really looking critically at how we can scale up some of these interventions like the social rental agency scheme. I was very glad to learn that the Ministry of Regional Development and Policy here in Poland has apparently received, I think it's around 100 million zlotys or $25 million US dollars to support social rental agency schemes in Poland. We'll also probably talk more about AMIF funding and some of the potential for that from Brussels. There's a lot of different menus and options to be discussed further. And again, I'm sure the vast majority, if not all of you in this room, are much smarter than me on these issues. And you'll be able to really kind of grapple in some of the working groups with how these things are taken forward concretely. On that note, if you talk about concrete, Mira and the Ukrainian House are all about that and working with the community. So maybe I hand it back to you, Mounia.
Reminding us that not much can be achieved without strong partnerships. And this is a point that I would like to be answered by all of our panelists today and hear from them. But before, we'd like to hear from Miroslava about your work with Ukrainian refugees, the work you were doing before, and maybe tell us a little bit about your own personal history and how you came to do that work with Ukrainian refugees.
Hello to everyone, and thank you for invitation and to be again in the panel. And I think for us it's also kind of thinking what we said like 1 year ago, and to reflect on that and to think in which place we are. In some points we are going forward. In some points I think I have some of the same points actually, unfortunately. And we as a Ukrainian House, it's a Ukrainian migrant organization. We work 15 years. And generally, we were engaged in the integration and information support to Ukrainian migrants, but not only, but generally because we are a Ukrainian organization, the main scope was on Ukrainian migrants. But since 24 February 2022, we became also as a humanitarian organization, and we provided support like in crisis support, and now also combined with integrational support. And also housing, which became one of the key elements of our support, because however we never did it before. So for us it was new direction. And also we comparing to international organization, we are not dealing with them collective accommodation. We developed the scheme of solidarity housing. It means we collected the data of the individuals who provided us with flats, and we matched them with the refugees who were looking for flat. And we developed a system of matching, and now since these 2 years we accommodated 30,800 people. So this is more or less what we do, and those what the points I have, it's based on our observations and also research, which is about more individual housing and people who live in host places, or they're looking for renting of flats. There was said before, there is in big cities is very difficult, and one of the points is of course not lack of the houses, lack of the flats, especially in big cities. And also that's why the refugees, they usually rent in not good quality flats. They also can rent together with others, also in distinct areas. And also it's and they also dedicate majority of their salary to the renting, because like the average salary according to research of the National Bank and also IOM, it's around 3,000 zloty. So I don't know how much it is in other currencies, but it means that it's a minimal wage, and unfortunately they pay around 2,000 to 3,000 for the flat. So it means they have little money left for the like food and other payments. So that especially it's visible in the big cities, but in the smaller cities there is available flats, but there is no social structure. It means integrational structure. So in big cities, we have Ukrainian communities, we have other organizations, you have network of support. When you go to small cities, you have less chances to get jobs, to have the support from your community and also local community. So it's that's why majority of migrants and then refugees tend to stay in big cities. Next, the problem it's a problem with integration. It means that if you have to change frequently your place of living, because also the people rent the flats, but it's also for short term. When you found the job, you found the place in school for your kid, and then you have to move to other part of the city, and then it becomes problem to find a new school and finding jobs, because in Warsaw it's a big city, and to travel sometimes it takes 1 hour, even 1.5 hours in one direction. So it means that it's really difficult for them to accommodate, to integrate. Then we also have the discrimination. Unfortunately, this means that for many of the hosts, they don't want to rent flats to Ukrainians, and we also see the announcements that it's only for Poles. So the flat is available only for Poles. It's not only the reason to say the xenophobia or something, but I think also it's more connected to the system. I think it's more you are experts more than me with the system, that people are afraid that they cannot evict, especially mothers with kids. And so they are afraid to rent generally, and especially if Ukrainians, so they're afraid if somebody will not pay and, leave to Ukraine, so you will not be able to have this money, or you will not be able to evict. However, there is the system of this najem okazjonalny, I don't know how to translate it, temporary rent. It's possible to evict, and there are some mechanisms. And I think we need some informational campaign that it's safe to rent a flat to refugees. Next issue is nowadays we have in Poland discussion on the prolonging of the temporary protection for Ukrainian refugees. And there is one of the solutions which actually we perceive as a successful, a very important solution, especially for vulnerable people. It means this 40 plus zloty to the owner of the flat in order to host the refugee. And especially we see there is a kind of discussion that there was some misusage of this, but in our experience of these 2 years, we didn't have like information about that. We have the fears now of the special vulnerable group, special elderly people and Roma community and many others, those people with disabilities, that if the program stops, they will lose accommodation. They don't want to go to the collective shelter because they have this experience and they really are fear of this. They rather prefer to return to Ukraine. However, if they are from the frontline territories, for them it's dangerous. So unfortunately for them, it's a big issue. And I think this is for us, is frightening, and that it would be evicted, this program. Then it's maybe a few short things and maybe just few things which we do in terms of helping people. So we help, as I said, with finding free of charge the solidarity accommodation. And now we also, to those who can afford, we help them to search for flats for rent. We help them in translation. We help them to check the contracts, to go to see the flat. Also like a whole time support to them, but also those who want to rent to refugees. So because we also can consult, we can say what is safe. So in that sense, we provide this complex support. We also have interventional flats, 2 flats. This is new thing which we do. It means that it's a temporary in terms, like people have emergency and they need to stay sometime, few days, sometimes few weeks. And next, goes in our case, it's a complex support. So it's not only helping to find flat, but it's also language courses, helping to find jobs, helping to send kids to school, like all the package. And I think this is important to think about housing, not to separate it with the kind of complex support that they need and to be independent, to live independent life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miroslava, and thank you for the great work you do with refugees. This tells us a lot about all the challenges that refugees encounter for integration. But even though I have not been through that experience myself, my thinking is that once you have gone through all of this and finally you are able to find a job, you're able to have housing, your children are registered at school, how hard is it to go back and go through all of this again, going back home? So do we know, and this is a question to everyone, do we know the proportion of refugees who stay in their host communities after, if the reason for their displacement is conflict, after the conflict ends? Or do we have a sense of that percentage, even a vague one?
I'll defer to my colleagues at UNHCR who probably got the data on the back test. Can you hear me now? Okay. So also I'll defer to my colleagues from the IOM and UNHCR to really share the data, etc. For me, it's been a personal journey. A little over 3 decades ago, my family left Sri Lanka due to the civil war and moved to Canada. I don't belong to the legal definition of a refugee, but had to migrate due to the conflict and didn't return to Sri Lanka. So what was the reason? Because safety and security was really at the core. So oftentimes when people ask this question about, is it possible to return? I think there is always the possibility. I'm Canadian, but I'm emotionally attached to Sri Lanka. I would love to return to Sri Lanka at some point. But is it safe? I belong to a minority ethnic group, but I also belong to a religious minority group as well. And at any given time, either of these groups can be very vulnerable. So when there is social exclusion, when there's vulnerability and safety and security is at the core, the concept of returning is not always an option. We would like to think of it as an option, but it's not always an option. And I just appreciate the fact that there's another country that was willing to adapt me and I was able to integrate. I wasn't assimilated, but I was integrated into that society. And when that option is presented, I think I can speak for many Sri Lankans, so in Canada and other parts, including my family, and quite frankly, given the option, they wouldn't return. So I just want to share it more as a personal narrative, but I'll obviously defer to the others whose bread and butter work is actually facilitating this process. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to add, I mean, I think it's important to, in the context of Ukraine and the Ukrainian situation, to maybe pause and just reflect on where things stand currently. You have 4 million people forcibly displaced within Ukraine, forced out of their homes because of persecution, because of conflict, bombs, missiles dropping in the vicinity of where they live. And there's a lot of complexity in terms of those movement patterns within Ukraine itself. Some that have been able to return, some have not been able to return. Getting into the details of that probably transcends this forum. But there are 6 million refugees in Europe who've crossed a border to seek international protection. 1 million of them remain in Poland. Of course, Poland was one of the major gateways to safety, to asylum. And what I'd like to really focus on in responding to this question is the fact that by protecting and including in the economy, and that includes housing, and empowering refugees, we're building human capital and resilience for a brighter future. Now, unfortunately, in the context of Ukraine, everyone in this room knows the situation is far from clear, and this remains a refugee situation. These people need asylum still, and we are nowhere close to facilitating returns, although some people may voluntarily choose to do so. It depends on the individual, their circumstances. But what we need to do at this stage, from our vantage point, is the UN Refugee Agency and our partners, is really invest in that human capital for the future. And we don't typically talk about this in the context of housing. But if you don't have decent housing and a place to stay, how can you maintain your assets, maintain your family unity, your dignity? One of the things that we discovered last year with Deloitte, a major accounting and financial firm, in a study, is that in 2023, Ukrainian refugees in Poland contributed a whopping 1% of the GDP to the Polish economy. Now, this is astounding when you think that 90% of the Ukrainian refugees in this country are women, children, and elderly, and a number of them with severe psychosocial trauma, some with physical disabilities, and the list goes on. But the good example of Poland in this context, which gives us hope for a return one day when conditions permit, is that they have not just protected those people, but they have included them. And a key part of that, and perhaps one of the most complicated parts of this in some ways, is the accommodation piece. Livia mentioned there's 40,000 Ukrainian refugees currently living in collective centers, 2 years on since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So there are a lot of challenges, but I think the message is we need to continue to invest in human capital. Housing is part of that. And ultimately, we hope that will lead to a situation where people can return in safety and dignity and voluntarily.
Kevin, because you actually answered what was going to be my following question. So given that a significant percentage, we suppose, of refugees tend to stay in their host communities, what are the long-term policy implications? And I would like to hear from Livia as well about this point, and then from Patrick about how that has forced Habitat to review its priorities. Livia.
Thank you. If I can just very quickly react on the previous question, because I was at another conference this morning organized by IOM about a new phenomenon we see in Poland, and that's large inflows of migrants from Latin America arriving in Poland. And this is, again, very directly linked to Ukraine crisis, because following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainians have left, creating labor shortages in Poland, and labor migration started working the forces of the market, and we now see huge numbers of Latin Americans arriving in Poland, end up being exploited in various industries here in Poland. And So, but there was a very, very nice point by one of the panelists made, who is an expert on Latin American migration here in Poland, who was saying, when we discuss labor mobility schemes, would labor mobility would be a safeguard for migrants to prevent exploitation? And she was saying, if you think of migrants arriving in Poland, don't think of them as temporary. Very likely, if they come here, they are successful, they're safe, they will probably bring their families here, they will want to be integrated. So I would like to make the point of non-returning or integrating for other categories as well from many other regions, because this is simply how migration works. And I really hope that in Poland we can have and we will have the safeguards in place, be it labor mobility agreements or otherwise, to do that. And going back to your point, Kevin, on housing being a very big part of integration, we are at a very, very good point in Poland with the migration strategy being drafted. One of the first things that the government announced when they took over in December, we're going to draft a migration strategy for Poland for 2025-2030. And one of the 8 work streams on which the government or the Polish Academy of Sciences is working is integration, and housing is part of that. So we have to link. I know that we're discussing here housing, and we are a learned, converted audience, and we're all on the same page. But we have to also keep in mind the very bigger frameworks, national and in this case European, that this feeds into. But going back to your question in terms of the policy, I have already alluded to it a bit. And as you rightly mentioned, Kevin, we do have still quite a large proportion of refugees staying in these collective shelters. And according to the assessments done by the humanitarian community, but mainly, of course, by UNHCR and IOM, is that over 75% of those who are staying in collective shelters are not able at the moment to live independently because of mental health issues, because of caring for many children, because of living with persons with disabilities, and plenty of other issues. They are unable to live independently and are destined to live either in these collective shelters or otherwise assisted apartments. And this is also something that a lot of the municipalities are working on and supported by IOM. So we do think that the issue of collective shelters will continue being at the forefront of the discussions, including of the migration policy and the law that is currently changing in Poland with regards to support the government is giving to these collective shelters. And we also are aware that there is a very important process of consolidation, because when I previously said that there is still 2 years on incomplete data about these collective shelters, one of the reasons is that they are run by various actors from in various locations. So at the moment, 2 years after the outbreak of the crisis, the government does want to have a better overview and consolidation of these places, perhaps also to ensure a more uniform standard across these places of residence. But we are concerned by some instances that we saw where these collective shelters were closed without much planning, without much thought into it, in a very ad hoc manner. And we did we know about instances where the refugees were left with no other options but to return Ukraine because facing with the choice of being in a collective shelter that's closing and no other housing alternative here, they did leave for Ukraine because there was nothing else, including to frontline cities, as you, Mira, rightly mentioned, which is a major protection issue, of course. Now, so we do hope that as part of the overall policy making here in Poland with regards to housing, shelter and accommodation, there will be a concerted effort to if there is a consolidation of these shelters, is for this to be done in a coordinated manner in collaboration with the humanitarian community that is working in these collective shelters already, and that is connected, very rightly said by Mira, with all the other aspects, because housing is just one aspect of integration. It's learning the Polish language, is being referred to jobs, it's finding the right schools for your children, increasing the number of children being back in school, and to transition from the online schooling that we have seen to a very large extent here in Poland to date. So we really hope that this is going to be changing in Poland very, very soon. Now, I would like to spend a bit of time on education, because in Poland, just a little over half of Ukrainian children were attending school. That is on the lower end in EU. There are countries, EU member states, where school attendance of Ukrainian children is far, far higher. And it has been thanks to the fact that there has been a policy on this from the right from the start of the crisis. We do think that these things are changing. In Poland, there will be a requirement, a much more pronounced requirement for Ukrainian children to attend school, linked to social benefits and other things. But if we do combine COVID and now with the prolonged crisis, we're looking at children having been out of school for many, many years, which cannot be good either for their mental health or for their education or for their future socioeconomic integration in the societies. I also want to spend a bit of time on because you mentioned, Mira, the temporary protection and how, of course, things are changing in EU. Poland is not the only country now proposing change in status. There are other EU member states looking into options, be it temporary residence or others. But we also hope that it will be connected with all the other options that have been on the table for the refugees from the start, being access to healthcare, access to education, access to jobs, and that the support for them, being language learning or otherwise, will continue together with the support that they're otherwise receiving. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Livia. I'll retain from that the policy implications are across the board. It affects education, it affects housing policy, of course, labor markets, and so on. But mostly it calls for more coordination among decision makers. Patrick, could you tell us from the standpoint of Habitat how the current crisis here in Poland with Ukraine, but all the refugee crises in general, have shifted the priorities within Habitat?
Yeah, I would like to bring the priorities back to the policy discourse for a moment, because that's such a critical part of what we do. So here's a question for us to wrestle with. Is it possible for us to consider viable integration without viable long-term housing solutions? So you think of the influx of refugees both here, Poland, in the region, but across the globe, quite frankly. And this is a challenge that we as Habitat for Humanity are confronted with. We called out, not too long ago, but we critically called out that one driver that's causing the global housing deficit that I talked about earlier in my opening had to do with mass migration. And the lack of integration has caused and continues to cause significant issues. But the good news is this. I'm looking at my colleague Roberto from Romania, our national director here. We spent some time with Roberto just a little over a year ago, and other colleagues from the region, when he took us and showed us the possibilities with empty spaces. It was not abstract. It was the reality. Meeting Ukrainian families, but also looking at possible viable solutions in terms of what Romania was able to do, Habitat office in Romania was able to do, facilitating, being a catalyst for partnerships, both with local government, but also with the private sector, was equally important for us. You heard a lot about social rentals just this morning, and you're probably going to hear much more over the next few hours as well. That's an important part for us, even as we look at integration as well. Because if we don't come up with those viable solutions, integration would just be another abstract term for us. And that's the reality of what refugees face in different parts of the world. So if I may just bring it back to the policy discourse, for us at Habitat, even as we look at the work that we do, a key priority is not to ignore the drivers that's causing this global housing deficit for us. And Europe is not exempt or immune. And one part of that is looking at integration. Is integration truly feasible? And the short answer is we're saying yes. countries are beginning to demonstrate that possibility. So it's no longer just looking at the short-term emergency responses that, organizations typically tend to do. That's important, but long-term housing is important. And happy to say many of our country officers in this region have made this just not a strategic priority, but an important part of our advocacy and policy initiatives. I just want to make a plug for one more thing at a global level that we're doing. It's our global campaign called Home Equals. Home Equals is about informal settlements. The definition of informal settlements obviously varies from region to region, country to country. But this conversation we're having right now has such a strong correlation with what we are trying to actually articulate through the Home Equals campaign. It's a fairly audacious campaign. It is global in nature, but it can be contextualized locally. So one of the things that I would call out is, like I said this morning, this is not about habitat. This is about us collectively coming together, looking for solutions based on a shared conviction. And we are very happy to talk more, just not about this campaign, but some of the policy level decisions that we've made to put integration at the core of housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, Kevin?
I'd just like to build on some of what Patrick said in terms of the policy discussion on housing. And I say that with some reluctance because I am not a housing policy expert. I'm a humanitarian and I've worked in refugee situations around the globe. But being in this situation in Poland, I've been forced to try to understand and learn a bit more about this. And one of the key partners for us to do that has been Habitat. So I've learned a lot about social rental agency schemes, the fact that in Poland, Habitat spearheaded the passage of legislation, I think in 2021, which is now being implemented. Of course, there's been some challenges in some instances at municipal level, but it's moving ahead. And the big question has been, how do we scale that to have a bigger impact? But as I mentioned earlier, it sounds like there is funding coming now from European Social Funds Plus, maybe even from the state coffers in Poland, I don't know, to support that. So to me, that's very interesting and exciting, and it builds upon some pilot projects that all of us here were involved in last year on social rental agency scheme. So very interesting and really excited to hear what the recommendations are to take that to the next level. Because I think when we talk about this, and this is congruent with what you're saying, Patrick, we have to talk about how do you scale this stuff. It's one thing to have very kind of, targeted interventions for people who are at risk. That's critical. It's important. That's a lot of what we do as humanitarians. But when you're talking about this issue, is it such a scale that it requires systemic answers and solutions and policy. Related to that, I want to just reflect a little bit on the public-private partnership aspect. I'm not an expert in this. I'm relying more on our friends from the International Finance Corporation. We're having some discussions with Habitat as well in this context. We've had discussions with institutional investors, with private banks. One of the things that I've learned when you talk about the supply and demand equation is that in some instances in Europe, and I think this has been the case in Poland to some extent, there's quite a lot of focus on the demand side of the equation. So you provide, for example, first-time buyers with a 2% mortgage. Well, that increases a lot of money in the market, but it also drives the prices of rent up. And it's not surprising, perhaps, that in Poland, if I'm not mistaken, last year the rent went up more than any country in the EU except for Croatia. I think it was number 2. So that's on the demand side, but how do we address the supply side? Now, one way you do that is by, investing in social housing. Now, there's a debate, I think, even currently within the government of Poland. Do we go down the social housing route where people don't pay? It's the government that's paying. Or do we look into low-income housing options? I'm not an expert in this. It strikes me that you probably need to do both. And part of the low-income housing option can include social rental agency. I guess it could include public-private partnerships. I don't know how all of that breaks out. But I think that we need to think big when we look at this issue. I think we need to think about scalability. We need to think about systems and about policy. I approach it with a lot of humility because, again, I'm not an expert in this. But when I see the needs of the refugees, not just in Poland, but throughout Europe and globally, this issue is of such critical importance when it comes to integration, inclusion, and ultimately solutions for refugees and their families, that I think we need to go big. We need to think big. We need to be bold. And I think that there are an awful lot of people in the room here today who will be able to formulate some of those things in ways that I probably don't understand, but you do. And I would encourage a robust discussion, particularly from my vantage point, on the ambit of public-private partnerships. I know those can be risky in some instances. I said this last year at the Housing Forum, and I had some tough questions from the audience about some of the perhaps fraught experiences in that context in Poland. I don't know all the details of that. I don't know all the history of that. I don't purport to know that. But what I do feel instinctively as a humanitarian working on refugee issues is that we have to go big. And we have to look at the policy issues and the advocacy issues in a smart way and in a collective way.
Thank you, Kevin. And not much can be achieved without financing. On that point, Patrick, could you tell us about the partnerships and the actors who have been involved?
I think Kevin said it really well. He summed it up well. I use the term, people, public-private partnerships. We call it the P4 model. And then we heard from Maria later this morning about, love the concept of the P4, but you use the term plural partnerships. I think it just brings us back to, the core of what we're trying to address. Listen, bottom line when it comes to financing has to be, again, predicated on partnerships. There's no way the private sector can be excluded or should be excluded from the narrative that we are trying to craft here. Why do I say it is? Look at the reality of global housing in general, right? If we don't bring the private sector in a meaningful way, meaning really defining the role of the private sector as being a critical part of the value cycle, not transactional, but value cycle, we are going to lose out. And quite frankly, my lament has been, I don't claim to be a housing expert either, but I can say this much, just going by the sheer numbers, like I shared some numbers earlier this morning, if we can bring the private sector in a more meaningful way, in a more compelling way, with definitely just not based on a return on investment, but return on impact as well, social impact, there is plenty of opportunity for us to really look at options that we haven't considered. On the financing piece, for me, again, Kevin said it well. If you look at the multilateral agencies that are quite engaged, we are engaging the IFC in a very meaningful way with our micro-build fund. And we are also in the US, cultivating a very critical partnership with the DFC or the Development Finance Corporation. With our micro-build fund, it's really providing, it brings back to the core of housing, is to say, how can we actually catalyze housing through this particular financial instrument and provide opportunities, again, for these vulnerable groups who normally don't have access to traditional financing. So that's another critical part of what we are trying to do on the financing side. If I may just say one final thing in this regard is the beauty of us having just not footprint, but presence. And the definition of presence is not just having a country office or a national organization, but partnerships. For us, the Tuvilega Center for Innovation in Shelter is a good example where we have just not presence in a country, but the TCIS model is to work with other partners in other contexts. So it's not flying the habitat flag at the end of the day. It's ensuring that our relevance in a particular country context when it comes to financing and our interventions are viable is supported by our partners. So that's pretty much the narrative for us when it comes to looking at partnerships and financing.
Thank you, Patrick. We will open up the floor to questions from the room in a few minutes, but before that, I would like to hear from all of our panelists about the lessons learned from the current crisis in Europe that you think could benefit other parts of the world, and similarly, lessons from other parts of the world that you think were useful in tackling this crisis. And I will start with you, Miroslava. But if you have any comment to say about the previous points that were addressed, feel free to use this time for that.
Yeah, maybe just to add about, we had discussion also with the Migration Consortium, which you are part, about this possible solution. And I think in our case, like the social renting agencies is one of the kind of good solutions, because then they can secure the contract, like they would be making contract with the owner and they would provide this security to those who rent. And I think this is, we see that would be effective way to deal with this. And also what is important, I think in Polish context, that it's a bit problematic if the programs are directed only to refugees. So it should include other vulnerable groups from the society. So then it's pursued as a kind of inclusive, because this is, if it is only selected on refugees, it also increases this antagonism and hostility. And next thing, I think this all mechanisms which should be developed, they should include like all vulnerable groups and from the host society. And in terms of the lesson learned, and I think which should be shared, I think this is still a proud thing in Poland that these hosts. We have like a majority of people who came here in the beginning, especially they were hosted by private people, and they welcome it, and they were also very important kind of key to the integration, because they also provided support how Poland functions. They help to send kids to school. They help also with some language, practicing language. We also have employees who said, well, I was practicing Polish. I learned it fast because I had to talk to my owners. And that was also one of the key. And we have many good examples. Of course, we can talk about some problems with let's say, using the labor of refugees at home as households, but still, generally, it was very good entrance points to the society, to the country, and the people who came, they got really huge support. And I think this combined with this program, governmental program of 40 plus of the subsidies to the owners, I think it's worked well to support this scheme. And I think this is a good example of how to kind of support this kind of mechanism, because in Poland we have the community sponsorship is only tested, so we don't have other solutions like money assistance is not very well perceived by the host community, even if it helps the people to stand on their both feet. So that in that sense, I think we should think about the programs that could include both host society and refugees, and also to be proud of this hosting by local community.
Thank you, Miroslava. I hear you say that partnerships are at the institutional level, but they're also at the individual level. So really, we are looking at partnerships everywhere. Kevin?
My team gave me a list of good practices and examples in Europe on housing, and I have to say I don't think I'm smart enough to talk about it, but probably a lot of you in the room are, and you'll have discussions with my colleagues about it. But what I would say is, and this is in some ways following on what Mira said, a good practice in Europe in the Ukraine situation and in Poland is the fact that they included refugees. From the very beginning, with the Temporary Protection Directive, with legislation, they allow people to work, have access to school, healthcare. The housing piece is a bit difficult, but even in that context, there was a lot done to help people, and they stayed in collective shelters in the first instance, and then a lot of work in the incipient kind of early phases on social rental agency has now set us up, in Poland at least, with the opportunity to scale that. So I think that's interesting, the social rental agency stuff that has occurred. I'm particularly excited about the possibility of some of these pilots that we're looking at with the International Finance Corporation. Now, I don't know if Ari Naim or Olga are in the room, and I don't want to commit IFC to anything they can't commit to, because we're very much in the initial phases of kind of modeling and understanding how this might work. But to me, that's exciting, and it's potentially scalable at a fairly large scale. I also mentioned that we've had some discussions with institutional investors from the private sector. And those of you who are from Poland probably know that you have a lot of large institutional investors, largely foreign, from Austria, from France, and Germany in particular. And they are investing like crazy in commercial and residential real estate, but in the middle to upper income segments, because the business fundamentals in Poland are fantastic for real estate. The problem, though, is when we talk about people who cannot access social housing, because there's a long waiting list, even for Poles, I think it's 150,000 people who are waiting to get social housing, or they have, the so-called rent gap where they don't qualify even to move into some of the transitional, schemes to get financing in a public-private partnership context. So, that's the area that we really need to focus on. I'm not smart enough, again, to really be able to give you any good examples in Europe. There probably are many, and I'm sure many people here will share them. We're looking forward to hearing about that and learning from you. And whatever we can do as UNHCR in our humble capacity as a humanitarian agency to support that advocacy with the government, to collaborate with the government, be it at the central level or with mayors at the municipal level, we're very happy to play our part. We're not experts in this material per se, but whatever we can do to help in the advocacy effort together, we're very keen to do that.
Livia. Thank you. First, I would like to actually quickly react on the issue of financing, because one thing that is definitely was mentioned, and I fully concur with, is the role of the private sector. Of course, that is a national budget. But here we are in EU, and large projects in Poland, thankfully, are supported by the European Union, as they are in other EU member states. The only challenge I see, while on the one hand, we are very fortunate that here we have this possibility. We do see that and we are of course fully aware that the European funding is following very specific cycles, very specific objectives that are sometimes set long before even watershed events like Ukraine, for example, happens. So the challenge here is to make sure that the funding available to projects like this is fully aligned with the needs, even though given the European or EU administrative and legal and financial frameworks that guide such programming. But going to your question on the temporary protection directive, I completely concur with Kevin when you said that the temporary protection directive has made a lot of things possible. Actually, the former Director General of IOM, Antonio Vitorino, is the architect of the Temporary Protection Directive when he was the DG Home Commissioner in the Commission. And as far as I know, it has never been used in EU up until Ukraine. So it's sat there as legislation for a good 20 years, and it was only used, of course, with the Ukraine crisis. And like you said, Kevin, it gave Ukrainians, the refugees from Ukraine, the ability to work legally, to access social services across the board from the moment, almost from the moment that they arrived. So when you asked about lessons learned, I was trying to go back. I've been with IOM for 20 years, and I could not recall a place where I worked where I would see the equivalent of what we saw here. Actually, quite the contrary. Very often it's the other way around. It's an uphill battle to advocate for integration of IDPs, integration of migrants, integration of refugees. So the solidarity that we saw here is almost the level of solidarity, the level of assistance by civil society, by the public, by the volunteers is absolutely almost unprecedented, I would say. So on the one hand, we are using, of course, lessons learned, humanitarian standards from other countries here in Poland. But at the same time, it is quite a unique situation because many of us coming from humanitarian settings, we find ourselves doing emergency response in a beautiful, developed, rich country, which is one of the paradoxes of the Ukraine response. So rather than looking from lessons learned of other crises in Poland, I am thinking of lessons learned of Poland for other crises. And I think the major one, the biggest one is, look, it works. If you enable the access to labor market, if you enable access to social services, refugees start to contribute. They start to contribute to the national budget, to the National Social Fund. It works. So I think it's more the lessons learned from here that we'll be hopefully seeing in other regions. And we often forget that here we are in the European Union, but there are regional arrangements in other parts of the globe. We have the ECOWAS in West Africa. We have SADC in South Africa. We have the EAC, East African Community in East, and you have the same in ASEAN, in Asia Pacific, same in Latin America. So I hope, if not done already, I think there is something in ECOWAS, but if not, I really hope that this temporary protection directive will be looked at closely as practice potentially for regional arrangements like these for the future as something that worked and that enabled refugees to access these services from when they needed it most. Thank you.
Indeed, from statistics from UNHCR, 3/4 of refugees are hosted in countries that are low to middle income. So indeed, that makes this the situation here in Poland quite unique, or at least not representative of what the majority would be. Patrick, could you tell us a little bit about lessons learned? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So, Kevin, my team didn't give me an exhaustive list of examples, but we do have some concrete examples that we would like to talk about. And I'm Mounia. I'm just going to look at 3 headings to really sum it up. The first one is around integration. So if you think of our work in Jordan, for example, as a best practice, and the way we've integrated refugees from, the Palestinian refugees and later on the Syrian refugees, I think it's a classic example of community-level integration that Habitat has really focused on and done well. We can do more, but it's fair to say we've done well. So building on some of the best practices that we learned and lessons learned from, the Palestinians crossing over into Jordan for several years, and then when the Syrian influx took place, that was a very concrete example for us around what it means to look at community-level integration. The second one was when the Beirut blast took place, the port blast took place in 2020. And I commend my team led by Rick Hathaway, our area vice president, is that, very quickly they responded by engaging we have a national organization in Lebanon, but what Rick and the team really did in Lebanon was to make sure that local ownership was both visible but also felt when it came to our response. So there were, again, lots of refugees from Palestine who were in the proximity where the blast took place. And our work at that point, the lesson learned there was getting the locals. So we worked with both the international organizations, but we worked with national organizations and community organizations to ensure that local ownership was felt. So that's the second piece around ownership. The final piece is long-term. See, when we talk about lessons learned, one of the things, the humility for us is to acknowledge what has worked for us, what hasn't really worked for us. And we're asking ourselves some critical questions. Where have we not done as well looking at long-term solutions? And we work in 70 countries across the globe. And I have to confess that there are places and geographies where we haven't done as well. And yet the lesson learned for us is this. We talked about long-term sustainability about our interventions. If we don't have, the financial sustainability to see the impact that we really, envision, that is a lesson for us. That is for us to say is we can do better the next time. And what Europe has taught us, particularly based on the Ukrainian crisis and looking at Poland, etc., is Poland is a very good example, and I close with this, is where we've been able to garner all our lessons, bring it together and say, we are going to look at Poland very differently. You heard from our new national director earlier today, and the way we are looking at just not our interventions, but looking at a future for Poland, the people of Poland when it comes to housing, our neighboring countries in Central and Eastern Europe, has been a direct result of our lessons learned from other parts of the world.
Thank you, Patrick, for sharing. Oh, Miroslava would like to
add something. Yeah, just was thinking.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much.
Saying that it's important to underline the role of diasporas, and I think as an organization that represents Ukrainian minority, I think also in many countries, where in case of Ukrainians, but I think it's also the case of other diasporas, that it was crucial for majority of people who came here. Many of them, especially in the first wave, they had someone they know or their family members, and they were using this network. They were hosted by those people, and also then later on was assisting them to find accommodation or further, or going further west, or finding place and work in Poland. And the same is in Germany. And if I am thinking about the organization that existed here before 21st of February, all of them were engaged in supporting refugees, getting them assistance in accommodation, all the needs, integrational needs. So also in collecting money and providing also basic needs. And even now, I think this is one of two places where you can get food every day, food, some basic needs, basic products, is led by Ukrainian organization. So this is also shows that like you can be tired, you can be exhausted because of war, but because it's it's something which is, because you are from the same kind of group and it's important to you to help. So that's why we are kind of the last to go out from the field. So we will work. And I think it's so important to underline it, because I've seen also in other contexts how important was diaspora to supporting refugees from the countries. Also, I think in Germany, Syria, and other, I know probably much better examples, much more examples, but it's very important to underline it. Thank you.
Miroslava, and your final word tells us that the situation is not great, but we have reasons to be hopeful because we have people on the ground at many different levels who work every day to make the situation better for refugees and for migrants. Thank you to all of you. Now I would like to open up the floor to the room for questions. I believe we have time for a couple of questions. Okay, so we have one gentleman here and we have the lady on the first row.
Szanowni Państwo, Styp-Rekowska, Uczelnia Łazarskiego. W tej roli kierownika studiów podyplomowych Akademii Rynku Nieruchomości jestem bardzo...
We have translation, like if we don't have the headsets. Can we have live translation by you, Martin? Okay, thank you.
Czy można zacząć od początku?
Dobrze. Więc właśnie w tej roli kierownika studiów podyplomowych Akademii Rynku Nieruchomości Uczelni Łazarskiego,
Krystyna Trzekotowska from Łazarski University.
I właśnie chciałam podkreślić, że w roli kierownika studiów podyplomowych Akademii Rynku Nieruchomości jestem bardzo wdzięczna za ten właśnie wspaniały dialog podkreślający znaczenie pomocy, jaką Polacy udzielają imigrantom ukraińskim dla ogólnej ochrony prawnej.
I would like to underline my appreciation for all the support that the Ukrainian refugee community got.
Jestem przekonana, że pozwoli to również uruchomić wiele instrumentów prawnych, które do tej pory nie istniały w polskim systemie prawnym, ale w praktyce nie były wykorzystywane. Na przykład
I am sure that we will be able to use many tools and potential that was already here but was not used. For example,
to, na co zwróciła uwagę szanowna pani Miroslava Keryk, czyli na wzmocnienie ochrony prawnej właściciela, żeby nie musiał się obawiać tego, że nie pozbędzie się niepłacącego najemcy. To można osiągnąć.
For example, the landlord protection, for him not to be afraid of letting people in his apartment.
To można osiągnąć wykorzystując uprawnienie gminy do zawierania z właścicielem umowy, na podstawie której przejmuje obowiązek płacenia czynszu za najemcę w określonym okresie czasu, do czasu, aż ten najemca nie stanie znów z powrotem na nogi.
Particular example can be a contract between the landlord and the municipality, in which municipality takes over the responsibility in some cases for paying the rent until the tenant is able to do so by himself.
Są miasta w Polsce, które wykorzystują to, a w innych zupełnie kompletny brak zainteresowania jest. Ale mam jeszcze jedno bardzo ważne pytanie i dziękuję, że tu zostało poruszone. Mianowicie, w jaki sposób możemy zapewnić ochronę osób starszych i niepełnosprawnych, dlatego że to jest bolączek wszystkich krajów Europy Środkowej i Wschodniej.
My important question is, how can we provide security, safety for elderly people and people with disabilities?
Jako założyciel Fundacji Pomocna Dłoń, członek zarządu, zbudowaliśmy wspólnie z rodzicami dzieci niepełnosprawnych pierwszy w Polsce, jak do tej pory jedyny, prywatny dom zamieszkania i rehabilitacji właśnie niepełnosprawnych dzieci.
I'm very interested in your answer because I'm working in an NGO and we, together with other people, formed a home in which those people can have.
I wydawało się, że to know-how może służyć rozwiązaniu tego problemu dla wielu rodzin w Polsce. Tymczasem zdarzyło się ostatnie wydarzenie takie jak pożar. nagle właśnie wybuchł pożar i okazało się, że polski system prawny nie zabezpiecza. Rodzice, którzy zbudowali, już w większości nie żyją, a nie ma możliwości uzyskania pomocy na odbudowę. Chciałam przy okazji podziękować fundacji właśnie tejże.
Tak. I to będzie nasze najlepsze podziękowanie.
Dobrze.
Please.
Martin, before you get the answer, if we can get the question from the gentleman and maybe a third
Can I
question
see
from
the hand?
we have
Yes.
a collective answer.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Alexander Jula, and I'm a youth delegate from Romania. And the integration of migrants and refugees is a really important subject, but it's still challenging because we are still struggling with some issues like xenophobia, racism, and other issues. And these things are actually reflected in number of people who are involved in volunteering activities in NGOs to help them, and more than that, in the number of social houses for these people. And my question is, what can we as human beings and as youth people can do to convince more people to be more involved and to create a better environment for these refugees, because they need to have some houses and they need a lot of support from ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have a third question? Yes, we do.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Harlan Stone. I'm from the United States. However, I represent Habitat for Humanity's Asia Pacific Development Council. And I would just like to comment on 3 words, if I could. The first is diaspora. So diaspora is the story of human greatness. And diaspora has created so much greatness in the world, and we are facing another period of diaspora, as Kevin also referred to. And as Patrick is an example of, my family also is from a diaspora family. This is the future of our species. Number 2 is the word humanity at the end of Habitat. So the humanity that I've seen here in Poland, this is my first visit, has been spectacular. And this is what everyone referred to, the humanity of the Polish people towards the diaspora of the Ukrainians is an example for the world to learn from. The third word I'd comment on has not been said explicitly, but is implied in all of the conversation, which is kindness. So the kindness is the essential human reaction to people in need. And here in Poland, kindness is abundant. And I think this is an example for the world, and I hope that we in America, as well as my friends in Asia, can learn so much from the Polish people and their kindness. Thank you very much.
Like to answer the first 2 questions. We can all have a final remark, which will be an opportunity both to answer and to say final words before we conclude this session.
I can just react quickly. I mean, the first thing I would say to the professor is we're grateful to you as Poland and the Polish people for assisting all of the Ukrainian refugees. You kindly said words of thanks to some of us who aren't from here, but I mean, kudos to Poland. I mean, incredible the response and the humanity and kindness of Polish people. Our friend from Romania, I mean, what can we do to stand up to xenophobia, to discrimination? Livia talked about the situation that refugees of Roma origin face. That's one example. You also have LGBTIQ plus communities, ethnic minorities, a range of people who are discriminated against. I think one of the things we can do, and maybe it's a very simple thing to say, is stand together and have one voice and not be afraid to do that, and to do that together as a community. But the other thing that I think we can do maybe more practically for some people who may not buy that necessarily is illustrate to people how when you accept refugees or migrants, it can also be good for society. It can be good for the economy. I mentioned this study we did with Deloitte that showed that refugees contributed 1% of the GDP to this country. I was having a beer with my brother-in-law a few weeks ago. He's Polish. He's 36 years old. He runs a small business, and he's a pretty progressive guy, but he asked me at different points, why are you guys doing all of this stuff, including in the housing context, to just help refugees? And my answer was, that's not our objective. Our objective is to do something that's going to help everybody, that helps the host community, Polish people, Romanian people, the migrants who come, the refugees who come. And I think one of the keys that we have to try to craft and sell in many ways, because it's true, but we have to present it in a good way, is that it's not just the right thing to do, the kind thing to do, the thing that human rights treaties tell us to do, to accept people and to allow them to seek asylum, but it's also good for society. It's good for humanity. It's good for the economy. Yeah.
Yes, Miroslava.
Yeah, I want to. The question the professor raised is actually a very painful question about how to help the elderly people. It's actually the very painful situation, because like 40%, even sometimes 50% of our beneficiaries in support center, these are elderly people, and they have no support. Actually, they have this 40 plus if they this assistance, plus they have Ukrainian pension, so it's like 300 zloty sometimes. So this is really difficult. They have so many needs, especially if you talk about those who cannot work. I mean, they want to work, but if you are 80 years old, it's really difficult. And I think this is, the issue, what you said about that Ukrainian refugees actually added 1.5 to the GDP. It's also the argument that actually we should develop this assistance program to them. It should be at least basic assistance, because I know that at least the Polish elderly people, they have pension, and the pension is also very small, but at least there is, and they have some kind of background, they have some family here. But those who came here, refugees, they don't have family members. They are really in very vulnerable situation. So I think this is special program. I know that in Germany they have some subsidies. It's not a big one, but it allows them to survive, to live at least in with some dignity. In terms of use, I think it's what I maybe just adding to what Kevin says. I think it's nice to work together. To involve youth, like also refugee youth in your activities. And I think just working on let's start in smaller level, doing some common initiatives together, because then not doing for them, just taking them in together. And I think that's important. And I also, because you have political rights, and you can also question politicians if they raise the xenophobic, racist issues. You are kind of have much more force in this regard. And I think during elections or criticizing them, showing what they do wrong, I think this is important. Working with media, and you have power. You are our future kind of politicians, and also those who will take over our world. So I think you can do much more. Thank you.
Miroslava, to go back to the elderly question. So when we are working with the vulnerable, with the refugees who are vulnerable, we need targeted interventions for the most vulnerable amongst them. And keep in mind that, as Kevin said, we're not helping refugees. We are helping people because they are vulnerable. At the end, we're helping everybody. Livia?
So I will address some of the questions that were. First of all, Professor, you mentioned that the current situation in Poland is launching or new legal instruments that were not used in Poland before. I think that the TPD, the Temporary Protection Directive, is one of them. But as I heard in another panel this morning from the Ministry of Interior, with the strategy drafting process in Poland, they are revisiting the overall legal framework too. Here, the foreigners' law dates from 2013. That predates not only the Ukraine crisis, actually predates the European crisis migration crisis from 2015, 2016. So these events can lead to changes, hopefully positive changes in the legal framework. And one of the things about the Temporary Protection Directive is the word temporary in it. It's a temporary solution, right? There has to be something after that provides lasting solution, durable solution for the refugees. So we really hope that there will be discussions and concrete and positive steps towards that. I also like your point about diaspora, because as the International Organization for Migration, diaspora is absolutely a key counterpart for us, key group that we work with. And apart from the cultural benefits they bring to societies, I would like to emphasize the point that Kevin made in terms of GDP. Here we're lauding the huge 1% of the GDP the Ukrainians are bringing. There are others where the migrant workers from the diaspora contribute even bigger percentage of the country's GDPs through the remittances. I think the number one could be Tajikistan. It's a Central Asian country, as far as I remember. So the contributions of the diaspora locally to the host community, but also back to their home countries, is undeniable and huge. Last point on xenophobia. I very often cite to me, a staggering statistics from the Ukraine response. Because when we were doing surveys among the refugees that were temporarily returning to Ukraine, because there is a lot of back and forth between Poland and Ukraine, in the very first few months of the crisis response, we asked them if they faced discrimination or any sort of harassment in Poland. And 80 to 90%, if I remember correctly, said no. They felt very welcome, they were supported, they had positive experience in Poland. In Germany, we did a survey among third countries, so non-Ukrainian refugees fleeing Ukraine. One thing that's often forgotten, that it's not just Ukrainians who have fled the crisis. There were over 100 nationalities of migrants, students, families in Ukraine that fled at the same time. Anyone from Argentina to Vietnam, really huge numbers. And if I remember correctly, the results at that time, from the survey in Germany, it was the other way around. Over 80% of those non-Ukrainians fleeing Germany have noted discrimination on the way leaving Ukraine and transiting through EU member states to wherever they were going. So this is absolutely a huge issue. And you asked the right question, what to do about it. One thing is for us in IOM is huge, and that's countering the narrative. How do you counter the narrative? You bring the positive examples, and I think there is no shortage of positive examples from migration and refugee situations to share. So bring up the good stories, show how much migrants and refugees bring and contribute to society. The other aspect I would mention is social inclusion, and it's an effort. It's an actual effort to make the inclusion work for everybody. And there are very specific initiatives that you can do called social mixing, to make sure that the refugees or migrants and the host society spend time together, learn about each other. Here in Poland, we have a network of integration centers which provide this Polish language classes and labor market inclusion activities, but we also do a lot of social inclusion activities. And this is precisely to connect the refugees and migrants with the host community through a series of culture events, meals, picnics, you name it. It's really these small things happening at the community level that contribute to greater acceptance. And yes, it does include the elderly too. It does include, we do a lot of things where we bring senior citizens from the Ukrainian refugee, from the Ukrainian refugees and the Polish senior citizens together to spend time together, to talk, because luckily in terms of language, it's not the same language, but it's close enough to ensure understanding. So I would close with that. Thank you.
Yeah. Patrick, the concluding remarks are for you.
Yeah, I'll just keep it brief, and I just want to come back to a young friend from Romania, and thank you for that question and being courageous enough to ask that question. It's interesting, about 35 years ago when I first moved to Canada, it was just after high school, equivalent of high school. Canada and the city of Toronto, where I moved to, was also quite different at that time. And it was not unusual at that time when, not a majority, but some people would say, go back to where you came from. And I thought that was quite rich, because in a country like Canada, if that was the case, we would all have to go back to some part of the world, except notwithstanding our First Nations community. So that I thought was rich, but Canada has obviously changed a lot. But my bigger point is this: we all live with labels. Growing up in Sri Lanka, I was an ethnic minority and a religious minority, and I was always referred to. The forms that I had to fill clearly called me out as a minority. And when you're a minority, and there are many minorities here for a fact, is there's a level of vulnerability that not everyone understands and appreciates. That's a reality that we live with. I moved to Canada and I'm labeled as a visible minority. Terminology keeps changing, but nevertheless, you still live with a label. Now I'm called a person of color. I'm still called out. Okay? For better or worse, that's a reality. So this is the point I was going to make. And Harlan, thank you so much for calling out what you did, the 3 words. Diaspora, humanity, and kindness. And what I've garnered from what you said, Harlan, is this. We all have our spheres of influence. I do, you do, we all have. And it's important for us to ask, how can we influence change when it comes to xenophobia, barriers to integration, etc.? Sometimes we wait for systems to change, but we could be the catalyst for that change. Don't underestimate each of you, whether it's the organization you represent or even at a very personal level, that you can be a catalyst for change. And not to be afraid, even as you pursue that change. Because just look back at history. If there weren't people who were bold enough to take that concrete step and say things had to change, guess where we would be? Okay? So that to me is the encouragement to say things can change, should change, and will change if all of us decide and agree that we too have our spheres of influence. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I will leave it to those words. There is no better way, I think, to conclude this session, that change is possible and we can all make some change happen. Thank you very much.
Going after clean. Investigation I can see forward to the list. Well, we'll would love to see.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our moderator, to our panelists. Yeah?
It would be good to call and God. I get you associate enough. Right, that's how we're including.
Thank you so much. We heard a lot of good things about working together. We heard about all the efforts that different actors in this housing sector take. One of the things that I love about what we do in Habitat for Humanity is this joining effort, is finding allies and doing things together. And during one of the team meetings that we had, there was a sentence that the heart of the organization, that the heart of all that we do, you can see it in volunteering, especially when we are talking about people who work in industry, who have this broad view, so they know the statistics, they know how the system works, but then how different it is to see it on a presentation and then to go by yourself and take a hammer in your hand, to go by yourself and see the apartment that is at the very end of the road. And this is what I really, really believe about what we do, is the change. At the end of the day, it's about human, and it has to start with a human. And I have a great pleasure to introduce to you Zygmunt Łopalewski, Communications and Government Relations Senior Manager in Beko Europe, working in Central Europe, who has over 18 years of experience in the home appliance industry. Currently, he holds responsibility for managing relations and authorities, public institutions, NGOs, and media across 10 countries in the region. And someone who has worked with us really hard and can tell you about it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. First of all, thanks a lot for an invitation for this fantastic event, and I was really very happy to hear just before a lot about the partnership and about the role of also the private sector. Of course, here I can start from the role of the private sector for the partnership with NGOs and for such organizations as Habitat for Humanity. which is a very, very long history for us. Okay, as you see, I'm representing the company Beko Europe, which is established 2 weeks ago. So I'm maybe some of you are familiar with the name of Beko, but this company was established by two global giants, by Whirlpool Corporation, American company, and the Turkish one, Keryk. And now I can say that today we are the number one with household appliances industry in Europe. And this is a stop. Okay, I will not advertise more the company. But I think that as the private sector, I can say as the member of the private sector, we are already aware that there is no economic growth without the engagement for the social issues, for the social development. So this is obvious for all the companies, I believe. And of course, the companies are, fulfilling these duties, this role on the several levels. The first level is, of course, very local. And it's very good because the local, even small companies, small enterprises, collaborating with the small communities, it's a big job to be done. And it's, I think that this is the biggest number of such projects. For the bigger companies, it's a little bit different. Of course, you can be aware that, and I assure you that every day we are receiving tens or hundreds of several requests to engage for some social projects. The point is that majority of these requests are showing that the potential partners doesn't know us. This is the problem. So saying partnership with Habitat in that respect, I would say this is like a relationship. So how to build relationship between the partners? It must be trust, it must be understanding of needs, it must be also understanding of capacities of the partners. And that we found several years ago with Habitat for Humanity globally, but also here in Europe and here in Poland with the Polish organization. So as the partners, the specific industry, okay, everybody is familiar with this industry, with the appliances. We already know what we have best. We have two things. First, the products, so the proposals for the consumers, which are the best in the class. But what is even more important for me is about the people. So we've got fantastic people. Now it's a family of 20,000 people from hundreds of professions who are willing to also to be the part of the local communities. And this is our need. So according to our strategy, according to our goals, we can, collaborating with such partner, we can fulfill the needs and expectations of our people and the expectations of our main stakeholders. And we do it. So I said understanding, trust. What is also important for me from the, this perspective, this more global perspective, is the complexity of, I would say, proposal given by the organization. It was visible, especially 2 years ago, when we faced, the escalation of war. I'm using the word war in Ukraine, where we faced with, several issues. Starting from the issues with the people being together with us in our organization, because we had almost 700 Ukrainian citizens working in our company. Now it's more or less the same, only in Poland. So first of all, we had, of course, to take care about them. But then we had several, spontaneous movements going from the bottom, and we had the signals, okay, guys, it was dedicated to the top management. Guys, let's do something together for the Ukrainians here locally, and let's try to collaborate on the international level. And together with Habitat, we were able, to find all that instruments, beginning from the money collection between the people, and it was spontaneous action in so many countries, I believe, within the entire EMEA region. Then it was volunteering. We had just only in Poland, we had, as I remember well, in that first critical period, we had 3 actions here in Warsaw dedicated to the Ukrainian refugees because it was the beginning. And then it was also, the donation of appliances. And the last part of appliances dedicated for that purpose was done, I looking for you, 1 month ago. Of course, without the big support of top management, including the person who is here in the room, Mr. Gilles Morel, our former CEO for Whirlpool EMEA, it would be impossible. But thanks to this volunteering day by day of the people interested, involved for this project, for this process, it would be impossible. And then, of course, I can say I'm also a volunteer. And that's, you mentioned on the beginning, I must say that the last action was taken 3 weeks ago. Not in Warsaw, it was in a different city in Poland. As the part of the volunteers, what can I say? This is a fantastic thing to be together with the people. Try to imagine that our organization is very, very, complex. We are not talking about one character of the people working in our company, like, white collars. No, majority of these people are, blue collars working in the factories in 3 locations in Poland. Then you have white collars, operating on the functions. Then you have R&D. Then you have shared service center. Then you have, service. Then you can imagine, this is the big organization with almost 7,000 people. And from each of these functions, we had always the people willing to take part in the volunteering. So, of course, for the organization, this is a fantastic opportunity. Why? Because engaging all these people, we were able, to have fantastic network between the functions of the company, which is, unique, because without that, try to imagine to connect blue collar from Wrocław with a manager from Warsaw. It's impossible. What is common for all that people, that they were really always engaged in 110%, starting from the beginning until the end. And what is fantastic, that they were asking, okay, to whom exactly we are helping for? So that's why your, expertise, your professionalism was really crucial, because you were able to tell to our people what we are doing here. So it's not just the trip, of the group of people somewhere to have the fun and to work a few hours. No, it was the goal very well clarified and, and described. So it was fantastic that then, after the end of the job, we were able to say, okay, so we helped to Mr. X, Miss Y, the family, the organization. So this is something which is growing in our organization. I can say that we've got more and more people willing to take part in the volunteering. I'm proud of it. And I would say that, okay, this is the baseline, okay? But then I believe that from the volunteering standpoint, we are able, for the future, also be the partner in bigger projects, more complex projects. And also what I heard, during the panel, also to be the part of the wider discussion on some instruments and solutions on the national level, how to solve the biggest problems which we face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zygmunt, and thank you all for being here. I think that you heard the word together many, many times. And this is not only together because we were together in all those events, in all those things that we did, but we are here together right now. And this is also an opportunity for us during the breaks, during the panels, to talk to each other. Maybe somewhere around you, there is an ally for your project. Maybe there is someone who has the idea you are missing right now. So this is a great opportunity for us. You might be thinking that there is a lot going on the stage. There are going to be 2 sessions at once, and you might be thinking, I might miss something. On the side screen, you can see a very particular way of taking notes, a beautiful drawing. You will have access to it. It's live, but you will also have access to it later on in the materials that you will get after the forum. It's all thanks to our artist, Dorota Kostowska, who is drawing for us. Right now, we know that you are really hungry for what's happening next, but you're also hungry for lunch, and we have it for you. But before we spread out information for you, right now we are in one room, but later on there are going to be 2 sessions at once, so you have to make some sort of choices, or either you have to bilocate into 2 of them. The lunch is going to be outside. If you follow the way to the reception and then you move downstairs, you will find the correct place, and our staff will be on the way showing you where the great food is. So please take your time, have a rest, and come back to us for another great session. Thank you.
Here.